Renata Bloom had worn her good Spanx for this. Not the comfortable ones she kept in the back of the drawer for lazy Sundays. The real ones. The industrial-strength, thigh-smoothing, stomach-compressing ones that left marks on her skin by the end of the night and made sitting down a minor athletic event. She had put them on at 5:47 p.m. with the grim determination of a soldier strapping on armor, and then she had pulled on the burgundy wrap dress, the one that made her waist look like it actually existed, and she had told herself, tonight is going to be good. She had believed it too. That was the embarrassing part. Renata was 31 years old, 5'4", and built the way her grandmother used to describe as substantial. She had a desk job at a mid-tier insurance firm, an apartment she couldn't quite afford in Lincoln Park, and a bad habit of giving people the benefit of the doubt long after they had stopped deserving it. She had met Derek Foss at a friend's engagement party 6 weeks ago. He was handsome in the way that men who know they're handsome often are. A little too put together, a little too practiced with the smile, but he had laughed at the right things and asked questions that sounded genuine, and when he'd asked for her number, Renata had said yes. He had picked the Whitmore for their first date. That should have told her something. The Whitmore was not a first-date restaurant. It was the kind of place people went to close business deals and celebrate anniversaries. The kind of place with a dress code listed on the website and a sommelier who said, "of course," instead of "sure." Renata had looked up the menu 3 times and quietly rearranged her grocery budget to make it work, because she hadn't planned on going Dutch, but she also hadn't planned on being caught unable to cover her half. Their reservation was for 7:30. At 7:25, she was already seated, because she had arrived at 7:15, because that was the kind of person she was. The hostess, a tall young woman with cheekbones like something architectural, had shown her to a corner table without blinking at the fact that she was alone. Renata had ordered sparkling water, declined the bread basket twice, and pulled out her phone. By 7:45, Derek had texted, "Running a little late. Traffic is terrible. 10 minutes. Promise." She had put the phone down and smiled at no one in particular. At 8:15, she ordered still water because the sparkling was getting expensive by the glass, and she had now been sitting here for an hour, with nothing but her dignity and a linen napkin. At 8:45, there was no second text. She sent one herself, something breezy, something that didn't sound like what it was. "Hey, are you still coming?" The 2 blue check marks appeared. He had read it. There was no reply. At 9:30, the couple at the table next to her got up to leave, and the man glanced at her as he helped his wife with her coat. Not unkindly. Just. He glanced, and Renata understood exactly what the glance meant, and she felt it travel from her face down to her stomach like a sip of something cold. 2 hours. She had been sitting here for 2 hours. She had skipped lunch for this. She had skipped lunch, bought new Spanx, gotten her eyebrows threaded on a Tuesday. And she was sitting alone at the Whitmore at 9:30 on a Friday night while Derek Foss, who had read her message and not answered it, was apparently somewhere else, doing something else with someone else. Renata picked up her purse. She was not going to cry. She was going to stand up very calmly. And she was going to walk out of this restaurant with the last shreds of her composure wrapped around her like a second wrap dress. And then she was going to get in a cab and eat a very large amount of Thai food alone in her apartment. And tomorrow she was going to be fine. She pushed back her chair. That was when the front door of the Whitmore opened in a way that doors do not usually open. It wasn't loud. That was the strange part. There was no bang, no dramatic entrance. The door simply opened, and then 3 men walked in, and the entire restaurant seemed to inhale. The man in front was tall. Not unusual tall. Just the kind of tall that reorganizes a room. He wore a dark charcoal suit that had clearly been made for his body specifically, not selected from a rack. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, longer at the top, and there was a scar along his jaw that he clearly had no interest in hiding. His eyes moved across the room the way eyes do when the owner of them has spent years cataloguing exits and threats and things that don't belong. His gaze landed on Renata, not swept past her. Landed. The two men behind him, both broad, both expressionless, both wearing the kind of careful stillness that spoke of training, stopped when he stopped. Renata sat back down. She wasn't entirely sure why. The man walked toward her table. Around them, the murmur of the restaurant had dropped by at least half. The sommelier had appeared from nowhere and seemed to be hovering at the edge of Renata's peripheral vision, with the particular anxiety of someone who knows something she doesn't. "You've been waiting," the man said. "It wasn't a question. I was just leaving," Renata said. "You were," he agreed. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the ease of someone who had never in his life wondered whether he was welcome somewhere. "Don't." Renata stared at him. "I'm sorry. Don't leave." He glanced at the sommelier, who materialized fully and immediately. "Bring the tasting menu. Start with something she'll actually want to eat." The sommelier said, "Of course," and vanished. Renata set her purse back on the table very slowly. "I don't know you." "No," the man said. "My name is Soren Wahl." He said it the way people say things they expect to be recognized. When she didn't react, something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but close to it. Then, almost imperceptibly, he seemed to relax. "You really don't know who I am, should I?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Most people do. I work in insurance," Renata said. "The most dangerous person I know is my building's super, and that's mostly because he controls the heat." Soren Wahl's mouth moved. It wasn't a full smile, more like the architecture of one. "What's your name?" "Renata. Renata." He said it once, like he was checking the weight of it. "Who were you waiting for?" She should not have answered that. She was not sure later why she did. Possibly the hunger, possibly the 2.5 hours of silent humiliation, possibly something about the way he asked it, like the answer actually mattered to him. Someone who clearly decided not to show up. Something crossed his face then. Fast. Something that looked strangely like anger. "His loss," Soren said. The food arrived before she could respond to that. Not the bread basket. Something else. A small plate of things she didn't have names for, but that smelled extraordinary. And then a glass of wine that the sommelier set in front of her with the reverence usually reserved for religious objects. Renata looked at the plate, then at the man across from her, then back at the plate. She ate. She was not going to pretend she didn't. She had worn the Spanx and skipped lunch, and it was 9:45 on a Friday, and the food was in front of her. She ate. They talked, which surprised her. Or rather, Soren Wahl asked questions, careful and precise. The kind of questions that people ask when they're not making conversation, but actually gathering information. He asked what she did, how long she'd been in Chicago, what she'd studied in school. She answered because answering was easier than the alternative, and because, somewhere around the second course, she had stopped being nervous and started being curious. He didn't talk much about himself. He offered the occasional fragment. He had grown up in this city. He had business interests that kept him here. He preferred restaurants with good sight lines, which, she noted, was a strange preference to volunteer, and deflected the rest with a kind of practiced ease that she was beginning to recognize as habit. "You're not going to tell me what you actually do, are you?" she said. It came out more certain than she intended. Soren looked at her. "No, okay." She picked up her wine. "The suit costs more than my rent. You have 2 men standing by the bar who haven't looked at anything except you and the exit since you walked in, and the staff is treating you like you have a button under the table that controls whether they keep their jobs." She tilted her glass toward him slightly. "I've been doing risk assessment for insurance companies for 6 years. I notice things." The smile came properly this time. Not large. Renata had the sense that large smiles were not something Soren Wahl did very often, but real. It reached his eyes, which were the kind of grey that Chicago winter skies sometimes managed right before a storm, and it changed his face enough that she felt the difference in her chest before she registered it consciously. "You notice things," he repeated. "It's a useful skill. It is." He was quiet for a moment, watching her with an attention that should have been unsettling, and was instead, somehow, steadying. Like being looked at by something that sees clearly and is choosing to stay. Most people in your position tonight would have been either terrified or performing. You're doing neither. "I'm not sure what you mean by my position." "Alone in a restaurant where you clearly don't belong," he said. "Having dinner with a man you don't know who you've correctly assessed as dangerous." Renata considered this. "You sat down at my table. I didn't invite you. You didn't leave either. The food is very good." He laughed. It was a short sound, like something that hadn't expected to happen, and it softened the angles of him enough that she looked away first. The thing was, she had been about to leave. She had been sitting there with 2 hours of humiliation, sitting on her chest like a stone, and she had been making herself small and invisible in the way that she had learned to do, had gotten very good at doing, and she had been convincing herself she didn't mind, that it was fine, that she was fine. And then this man had sat across from her and looked at her like she was something that mattered, and she had accidentally remembered that she was. She was still thinking about that when the restaurant's front door opened again. This time it wasn't quiet. Derek Foss walked in, looking the way men who are very pleased with themselves often look, a little flushed, a little loud jacket, slightly rumpled from wherever he'd actually been for the past 2 hours. He had a woman on his arm, which answered a number of questions Renata had been carefully not asking herself. He was scanning the room with the distracted energy of someone looking for entertainment, and then his eyes landed on Renata's table and he stopped. The woman on his arm said something. Derek didn't hear it. He was staring at Soren Val. All the color left his face in a single second. Renata watched it happen, watched the pleasant, self-congratulatory flush drain out of Derek's cheeks like water from a tub, watched his shoulders do something complicated, watched his hand drop from the woman's arm entirely. "Renata," Soren said, without looking away from his wine glass. His voice was very calm. "Is that him?" Renata looked at Derek, who was still staring at Soren with the expression of a man who has just realized that the thing he walked into is considerably worse than what he expected. She looked back at Soren. "Yes," she said. Soren set down his wine glass. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head toward the bar and made a motion so small that Renata almost missed it, and within moments, one of the broad, quiet men appeared at Derek's elbow. Not touching him, just there. Present in the way that a wall is present, Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "My associate will ask you to wait," Soren said across the room, at a completely normal conversational volume. "There are a few things we need to discuss." I didn't." Derek's voice had gone high and thin. "I don't have anything to do with." "Not yet," Soren said pleasantly, "but you have had quite a lot to do with keeping a perfectly good evening waiting for 2 hours, so you'll wait." The woman Derek had brought, who clearly understood the room better than Derek did, had already stepped backward and was now very efficiently not being there anymore. Renata looked at her plate, then at Derek, who was being guided toward a chair near the bar by the associate with the quiet, inexorable patience of a river moving around a rock, then back at Soren. "What exactly," she said, carefully, "is your relationship with Derek?" Soren picked his wine back up. He owes certain people a certain amount of money. It's been an ongoing conversation. He glanced toward the bar. "I came here tonight to continue it." Finding him was apparently going to be straightforward. I hadn't expected to find him quite so late, for reasons that I now understand. He stood me up to avoid you. It appears so. Soren looked at her directly. "I apologize that you were collateral in that." Renata absorbed this. She thought about the Spanx. She thought about the bread basket she'd declined twice. She thought about the 2 blue check marks on her phone that still had no response under them. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. The thing he owes, the money, is it going to be a problem for him?" Soren tilted his head very slightly. "Why?" "Because I want to know how much trouble he's in," Renata said. "And I want to know whether you're going to do something about it tonight, or whether this is the kind of conversation that continues." He studied her. "Why does that matter to you?" "It doesn't," she said. "Not personally. But I do his company's books." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Renata kept her eyes on his. She had not planned to say that. She had not planned any of this evening, actually. Not the Spanx, not the 2 hours alone, not Soren Wahl. But she had spent 6 years noticing things. And what she had noticed over the past 40 minutes was that this man was careful and precise, and not careless with information, which meant that the information she had just offered him was worth considerably more than she'd paid for the dinner. "You do Foss's accounting?" Not a question this time. "For Foss and Delray Partners, yes. I've been their external auditor for 2 years. She set down her fork. "I've also noticed some things there. In the books. Things that seemed like irregularities I wasn't sure what to do with." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind," Renata said, "that suggest Derek Foss has been very creatively moving money between accounts that he would very much prefer no one to look at directly." Soren was very still. She had learned, over the years, that the way people go still tells you more than what they say. Some people go still with shock, some with calculation, some with the particular flatness of someone who already knew and is waiting to see how much you know. Soren Wahl went still with something that was almost like satisfaction. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Suspected. Not known. There's a difference." Renata picked up her wine. "I don't have documentation with me. I'm at dinner." She looked at him steadily. "Allegedly." Another not quite smile. "Allegedly. But I have 3 years of files. Flagged. Organized." She paused. "I wasn't sure who the right person to bring them to was. Given that some of what I found suggests the irregularities may not be limited to Derek personally, meaning Derek Foss is not smart enough to have set this up alone, meaning whoever he's been moving money for is considerably more organized than he is, and considerably more interested in not being found." She looked at him steadily. "Meaning whoever's on the other end of that chain is the part I wasn't sure how to handle." Soren put down his wine glass. He leaned forward slightly, and in the lowered light of the Whitmore's dining room, with the murmur of the restaurant, reduced now to a kind of careful background hush, he looked at Renata the way that she had been looked at very rarely in her life. Like she was exactly what she was, which was not small, not invisible, not a woman to be stood up and discarded, but someone whose mind was a precision instrument that had been sitting unused in the wrong setting for far too long. "You've been carrying this for how long?" he asked. 7 months, alone. I work in risk assessment," she said. "I am very good at identifying when something is a risk." "And tonight?" She looked at him, at the controlled stillness of him, the patience, the way he had sat down across from her, without asking, and had not once in the past hour made her feel like she was too much or not enough, or anything other than worth talking to. She thought about the files. She thought about 7 months of careful documentation and no idea who to trust. "Tonight," she said, "feels like a calculated risk." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved the way Chicago always moves at night, with purpose, with noise, with the low thrum of 10,000 intersecting lives. Inside the Whitmore, the corner table had become a small world with its own weather. "The man who didn't come tonight," Soren said. "He doesn't deserve what you wore for him." It was such a specific thing to say. Renata's throat did something unexpected, and she looked down at her plate for a second before she could help it. "No," she said when she had it back under control. "He doesn't. The files," Soren said, "not pressing, just present. When you're ready. She looked up. I'll need something in return. Name it. Protection, she said simply. Not. I don't need a bodyguard. I need to know that when this becomes visible, and it will, I'm not the one who takes the fall for seeing it, that the documentation goes somewhere it will be used correctly, that I don't get buried because I was inconvenient. Soren looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Something that was not calculation, she realized, but something closer to recognition, like a man who has spent considerable time in rooms full of people who tell him what he wants to hear, encountering someone who is simply telling him what is true. Done, he said. Just like that. You spent 7 months carrying something dangerous alone because you were trying to do it right, he said. That kind of carefulness is worth protecting. Renata nodded once. She picked up her fork. The food was still warm. The kitchen, she suspected, had been quietly keeping things moving at a pace calibrated to their conversation, because nothing in this restaurant seemed to happen without calculation. She ate. She was, she realized, actually hungry, which was different from the hollow, anxious hunger of the first 2 hours. This was simpler. This was just hungry, sitting at a table that had turned into something unexpected, across from a man who was dangerous in ways she had not yet fully mapped, and careful in ways she hadn't expected, eating food she hadn't ordered in a restaurant she couldn't afford, on a night that had started as the worst of her recent adult life. She was, despite everything, all right. Near the bar, she was peripherally aware of Derek's voice rising and then lowering, of the quiet associate's complete lack of reaction, of a door somewhere in the back of the restaurant opening and closing with finality. He's not going to be a problem, Soren said, without looking up from his own plate. For which of us, either? Renata considered this. The woman he came in with, sent home. She knew enough to leave. Good. She speared something that turned out to be delicious. What happens to him? That depends on what your files contain, Soren said. And what you want. She thought about it. Not about Derek, specifically. She found, to her mild surprise, that she didn't have a lot of feeling left about Derek, because the Spanx and the 2 hours and the blue check marks had already done whatever damage they were going to do, and somewhere in the last 90 minutes, the wound had closed and become a scar, and the scar had become just another thing about her. That was fine. She thought instead about the 7 months of files, about what they were worth, about what she wanted them to be worth. I wanted to go somewhere real, she said, not buried, not used as leverage and then quietly disappeared. I wanted to actually become the thing that stops what's happening. The money moving, she confirmed, and whatever its funding. Because I've looked at the patterns for 7 months and I know that Derek Foss is not the point. Derek Foss is just a door. Soren looked at her with that same quality of attention. Still, focused, real. You're not what I expected tonight, he said. What did you expect? A frightened woman in a restaurant? I was frightened, Renata said. For the first 40 minutes after you sat down, she met his eyes. Then I decided it was more interesting to be something else. He was quiet. The storm-grey eyes held hers with the patience of something that has learned not to waste itself on things that don't matter, and she understood in the particular way that only clarity can arrive, that she was not something he intended to waste himself on. The files, he said. When? I can have copies on a drive within 48 hours. She paused. There's a condition. Tell me. You don't use me as a tool and put me back, she said. It came out very even, very clear, which was how she intended it. I'm not a source who disappears after she's been useful. If this goes forward, whatever this is, I'm part of it. I know what's in those files. I know how to read what's there and what it means. You don't get the information without the person who understands it. It was, she reflected, either the smartest thing she had ever said or the most reckless, and she found she couldn't entirely tell which. Soren Wahl set down his fork. He looked at her across the candlelit table. across the ruin of what had been a very good meal, across the strange wreckage of a Friday night that had collapsed and reassembled itself into something unrecognizable. He looked at her the way she had wanted without knowing she wanted it, to be looked at for considerably longer than she cared to count. "All right," he said. 2 words. Simple as weather. Renata nodded. She picked up her wine. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago always does, surviving, grinding, moving through the night with no particular interest in the stories being written inside its restaurants. But here, in the corner of the Whitmore, at a table that had been meant for someone else's evening, something had been agreed to that was bigger than either of them had arrived intending. When the check came, Soren signed it without looking at it. When they stood to leave, the 2 quiet men fell into position. Behind her too, now, not just him, and Renata noticed and said nothing about it and allowed it to be what it was. At the door she paused and reached into her purse. Her phone had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and 1 text from a contact listed as a friend. "Just heard you had a date tonight. How'd it go?" And she looked at it for a second with the pleasant, weightless feeling of someone who has set something down and has not yet decided whether to pick it back up. She put the phone away. Soren held the door. Not dramatically. Just held it. Renata Bloom walked out of the Whitmore into the cold Chicago night with her good Spanx and her burgundy dress and her 7 months of very carefully organized files, and she thought, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that a night could start as one thing and end as something else entirely, and that the something else was occasionally, against all reasonable odds, better.